and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we will have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to get you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now please join me in welcoming Director Bill Lacey.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks to all of you for coming out. We're delighted to welcome David Nichols back to the Dole Institute today. David has actually done, I think this is your third program here, but he also went on the road with us a few years ago, and we did programs in Manhattan and Topeka. So this will be, if I'm counting correctly, your fifth program on behalf of the Dole Institute. So that makes you one of our most frequent guests. So maybe we
have to do missionary work.
Yeah, well, maybe we should give you some frequent guesting points or something like that too. David's book is called Ike and McCarthy, Dwight Eisenhower's Secret Campaign Against Joseph McCarthy. It will be on sale, and David will be signing copies. Halloween's coming up, Thanksgiving's coming up, Christmas is coming up. Great opportunities. Everybody ought to buy 4 or 5 of them. Take them and give them to your best friends, and David will sign them for you. This is David's third book on Eisenhower. He wrote one on Eisenhower and race, one on the Suez Crisis, and this is, like I said, his third. He's a former dean at Southwestern College in Wichita. He's a good friend of the Dole Institute, and he is one of the top scholars on Eisenhower today. Please welcome David Nichols. David?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, folks. I always hear there are all kinds of exciting things to do in Lawrence, and here you are. I'm honored by that, and I don't know quite how to interpret it, but anyway, I'm glad that you have so little fun in your life that you're here to learn something, and that's great. So, please do let us know if you can't hear in the rear. Are you hearing okay back there? You're hearing all right? Okay. Well, don't hesitate to wave at me or cup the hands in the air, and I'll try to do it. I've been ill a little bit this summer, so the voice comes and goes sometimes. For decades, my profession was not kind to Dwight Eisenhower. In 1962, a survey of historians ranked Ike 28th out of 34 presidents who had served to that point. 28th out of 34. In other words, he was deemed an incompetent president, a grandfatherly figure who would rather play golf than exercise presidential power. Now, thankfully, we know the truth, and the word is spreading. Recently, C-SPAN conducted a survey of 193 historians. The result is that they now rank Eisenhower fifth behind only Lincoln, Washington, and the 2 Roosevelts. That's a sea change in the attitude toward Dwight Eisenhower. And I've been privileged to play a role in that causing that change, in addressing Ike's alleged failure. Particularly 2 things haunted him: his record on civil rights and his record in dealing with Senator Joe McCarthy, the demagogue who went after communists in every corner back in the 50s. So the Civil Rights book came out in 2007. Lots of people still don't believe its conclusions, but it's taken a decade for it to begin to sink in. Let's start with this story. I just tell you, this is an exciting story, and I hope I don't lose you in the detail of it. March 27th, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower won a big victory over Senator Joseph McCarthy. Ike's nominee for the ambassador to the Soviet Union, Charles Bolin, was confirmed that day by the Senate of the United States 74-13 in the face of McCarthy's fierce opposition. And Ike grumbled to his aides that, quote, the only thing McCarthy wanted was headlines, and he did not care how he got them. Ike said, "McCarthy has the bug to run for the presidency in 1956, he declared. Ike slapped his knee and thundered, "The only reason I would consider running again would be run against him." Knowing Eisenhower, he probably punctuated that declaration with a theologically incorrect expletive. You can figure that out? Okay. Flash forward, Ike had the language of a soldier, but the documents at the Eisenhower Library that I studied so well, the transcribers tend to edit that out. Flash forward to December 2nd, 1954. On that date, the United States Senate formally censured Joe McCarthy by a vote of 67 to 22. And after censure, when McCarthy stood up to speak on the Senate floor, the chamber would empty. When the senator sat down with other senators in the Senate dining room, his colleagues would make lame excuses and leave. The bands of reporters who had hung on his every word were gone. In late 1955, Army Counsel John G. Adams visited McCarthy at his home. They sat down, and Joe, who was a heavy drinker, poured 6 ounces of gin. He looked awful, Adams recalled. He had lost about 40 pounds, and his hands shook. The gin trickled from the corners of his mouth when he took a sip. Adams described the man he left at the door as, quote, "the cadaverous visage of McCarthyism, standing silently in the shadows, slowly dying." Indeed, Joe McCarthy did die on May 2nd, 1957. He was only 48 years of age. Folks, that's a peek into a very complicated story, and if I confuse you for the next few minutes, just remember the book is a whole lot better than the speech. The books are out there, and I guarantee it's better. I have to pick and choose what I'm going to share with you, and there are just good things in it that I can. In terms of mystery stories, this is a how-done-it, not a who-done-it. In a who-done-it, we know there is a crime, but you must follow the clues to find out who committed it. In a how-done-it, like in the old Columbo stories, some of you are old enough to remember those, we know who did it, and the question is how and why. William Ewald, a great friend of mine and great scholar, wrote a book a generation ago with a whodunit title, quote, "Who Killed Joe McCarthy?" Ewald's final conclusion was somewhat ambiguous. Mine is not. Dwight Eisenhower did it. Ike and his trusted aides, and I'm going to say this very carefully, Ike and his trusted aides launched a clandestine operation designed to wrap a gay lover scandal around the neck of a prestigious United States senator in the president's own party in an election year. That's about as tough as it gets in Washington, D.C. That clandestine operation, that scandal, is what the Army-McCarthy hearings in 1954 were about. Now, a word about that lover's scandal. The 1950s was a tremendously homophobic period. And just the rumor, not the fact, that someone was gay could cost them their job. And it may sound strange to us, but at that time, it was widely believed that homosexuals were security risks because the communists could blackmail them. And it certainly was a difficult, awkward, sensitive time for people who were gay. Perhaps you've heard the traditional explanations for Joe McCarthy's political demise. McCarthy, an alcoholic, did himself in. A second one is he was damaged by Edward R. Murrow's legendary See It Now television program. We'll come back to that. During the Army-McCarthy hearings, television unmasked McCarthy as the obnoxious bully he was. And in this conventional version, the final nail in McCarthy's political coffin was that censure vote by the United States Senate. Now, folks, those are all factors. But until now, we have not known that Dwight Eisenhower masterminded a secret campaign to discredit McCarthy. We have wrongly assumed that Ike was cowardly in his response to the senator, refusing to use the bully pulpit against him, when in fact he worked to destroy the senator behind the scenes. John Adams observed, quote, "Eisenhower's indifference was deceptive. he could be in control while appearing to loaf. And I'll just say to you, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a pundit. I don't put a phrase in one of my books that can't be documented or isn't the result of compelling circumstantial evidence. I just don't make things up. And those who would know my background know that I was not an Eisenhower fan when I started doing this research. If you want validation for that, I have a son named named for John Kennedy. And I was not, the documents, particularly at the Eisenhower Library, were a revelation to me. Well, who was Joe McCarthy? Just in case some of you old enough to remember Joe McCarthy? Yeah, okay, great. Or at least remember your parents watching the hearings. McCarthy represents what Richard Hofstadter, a historian, called the paranoid style in American politics. Such paranoia, Hofstadter contended, bubbles up every generation. More than a few pundits now think it surfaced again in 2016. In any event, McCarthyism is a staple in our political lectionary. You know, every generation we get scared. We get scared of something. It was communism in the 50s, it's terrorism in this period, and when people get scared, demagogues thrive. And Joe McCarthy did. On February 9th, 1950, McCarthy delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and the senator announced that he had, quote, "here in my hand, the names of 205 communists in the United States State Department." McCarthy, of course, did not actually have those names. That's folk news for the, pardon me, blew it. False news. Wait, what's Trump's name? Fake news. Okay, I don't quote the president well, I'm sorry. Okay. It's fake news for the 1950s. And William Ewald writes that from Wheeling onward, McCarthy presided over a permanent floating press conference. Lights, cameras, microphones followed him everywhere, and McCarthy was truly a master of fake news for the era that he was in. During his 1952 campaign, Ike tried to avoid talking about McCarthy. In 1951, however, McCarthy on the floor of the United States Senate had accused George Marshall, Truman's Secretary of Defense, the father of the Marshall Plan, and Eisenhower's mentor. McCarthy had accused him of treason. In 1952, Ike tried to avoid getting into the middle of that dispute, but on October 2nd in Milwaukee, he made a naive political mistake, and it's one he'd never quite lived down. Ike let the Wisconsin politicians talk him into deleting 74 words of praise for George Marshall that he put in his speech. He knew Joe McCarthy was going to be on the stage, and he wanted to stick a rhetorical thumb in his eye. And he had these words of great praise for George Marshall, and they talked him out of it. They said, "We might lose the electoral votes in Wisconsin. Please don't do that. McCarthy's too popular." And Ike reluctantly, angrily agreed to delete them. The problem was that Fred Seaton, does that name ring any bells? You know about the Seatons? They grew up in Manhattan, okay? You heard of that place? All right, okay. Fred Seaton was, we'll talk more about Fred later. He's a hero of this story. And the Seatons are a great newspaper family. But Fred Seaton had already alerted a reporter from the New York Times that Ike was going to say something good about George Marshall in that speech. When he didn't, the paper reported that he had cut it out, and furthermore, they reported that Joe McCarthy had talked him out of it, which was not true, was a lie, more fake news. McCarthy had claimed he had, when in fact he did not. In 1953, due to Eisenhower's election, McCarthy acquired a new platform for his crusade. The Republicans had captured a one-vote majority in the Senate, sounds a little like right now. McCarthy became the chair, therefore, of the Government Operations Committee and its permanent investigative subcommittee. In that capacity, the senators subpoenaed witnesses, conducted one-senator hearings, accused witnesses of guilt by association, and labeled as obviously communist anyone who dared to invoke constitutional protections against self-incrimination. Now, McCarthy hired Roy Cohn, that's C-O-H-N, a young legal prodigy, as his subcommittee's chief counsel. Cohn insisted that McCarthy add G. David Schein, the handsome son of a wealthy New York family, as an unpaid chief consultant. Cohn and Schein's intimate relationship would eventually trigger the 1954 Army-McCarthy hearings. And remember what I said about this being a homophobic period. There is no doubt that these guys were lovers. And it must be admitted the Eisenhower administration subtly used that fact against them. Eisenhower sparred with McCarthy throughout 1953. The senator repeatedly opposed Eisenhower's key appointments, including in the wake of the death of Joseph Stalin, Soviet specialist Chip Bolin as ambassador to the Soviet Union. I mentioned that a few moments ago. McCarthy even got Greek ship owners to agree to cease delivering goods to communist China, an accord he had no authority to negotiate. He held hearings into alleged communist infiltration of the Voice of America and frightened librarians in American overseas libraries into removing books from their shelves. And that led to the Eisenhower administration being accused of book burning. McCarthy sent Roy Cohn and David Schein, who were known as McCarthy's scummy snoopers, scummy snoopers, on an investigative junket through Europe that scandalized American allies. Now, despite the charges of book burning, Dwight Eisenhower is on record that he hated censorship. On June 14th, he spoke at commencement at Dartmouth College, and without mentioning McCarthy's name, the president said this: "Don't join the book burners." He's talking to the graduates. "Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go into your library and read every book, as long as that document does not offend our own ideas of decency. How will we defeat communism unless we know what it is and what it teaches? And why does it have such an appeal for men? Why are so many people swearing allegiance to it?" Now, Dwight Eisenhower loathed Joe McCarthy. And still, he adamantly refused to, his phrase, get down in the gutter with McCarthy. In fact, Ike refused to even mention McCarthy's name in public, believing that giving the senator presidential attention would only enhance his reputation. "The President of the United States cannot afford to name names," Ike wrote a friend. "Nothing would probably please McCarthy more than to get the publicity that would be generated by public repudiation by the President." During 1953, and I would just say this, Ike's refusal to mention McCarthy's name, the journalists didn't understand that at all. They didn't understand why, and he was urged to take on McCarthy rhetorically, but Harry Truman had done that, and McCarthy only got more and more famous the more Truman attacked him in public, and Ike said, "Nope, that's not going to work." And so he had his own reasons for doing it that a lot of people didn't understand at all. During 1953, Eisenhower had other pressing priorities besides McCarthy. The nation was still at war in Korea. I use that phrase carefully, but now all of a sudden we're hearing about war with Korea, aren't we? We're in war in Korea, which ended in July of that year. The American people were still recovering from the traumas of Depression and World War II. The Cold War with the Soviet Union had created a climate of fear that was the lifeblood of McCarthyism, especially the fear of subversion. I often think of how much, if we live in fear, we do some awful things. People who are fearful can just justify all kinds of things that are brutal and wrong and dangerous to our democracy. But in January 1954, Joe McCarthy's prestige was at its zenith. He had a Gallup poll rating, approval rating of 50% favorable, 29% unfavorable. By 1954, Eisenhower had concluded that McCarthy was more than a nuisance. He was a threat to the president's foreign policy goals, to his legislative program, and to his party's and his own electoral prospects. As I've already said, Ike believed he wanted to be president. In August 1953, Joe McCarthy launched an assault on communists, alleged communists, in the United States Army, and he did this with a 5-star Army general in the White House. The previous month, David Schein, Roy Cohn's boyfriend, had been drafted into the Army. And Cohn launched a frantic campaign seeking an assignment that would keep Schein with McCarthy's subcommittee and with him. Cohn constantly harassed the Army, insisting that Schein be made available for what was euphemistically labeled committee business on nights and weekends at a nearby hotel. Thwarted at every turn, Cohn angrily threatened to wreck the Army. In August 1953, at Cohn's behest, McCarthy launched hearings looking for communists in the United States Army, and this was in direct retaliation for the Army's refusal to give David Schein that special commission. McCarthy brutally harassed innocent people who testified before his subcommittee. His first hearing on the Army took place on August 31st, 1953. Much of the transcript of that particular hearing is in the book, but don't have time to share it with you. But imagine that you are Doris Walters Powell, an innocent, frightened African-American clerical worker on maternity leave, just sworn in to this hearing. And Joe McCarthy's first words to Doris Powell were, quote, "Let me say this, Mrs. Powell. We have information of Communist Party membership on your part." I still get a cold chill when I read that transcript. It was brutal. He warned her that, quote, "a number of people coming to the committee guilty of no crime except membership of the Communist Party, which legally you know is not a crime unless the party is using force or violence in the overthrow of the government. In the end, when they leave the committee room, they're guilty of perjury. If the answer tends to incriminate you, don't answer. Tell the truth or don't answer." And the fear in Doris Powell's voice leaps from the pages of the transcript. "I am on maternal leave from the government," she plaintively responded. Well, you can read more of that in the book. It's quite a hearing. However, Eisenhower was already busy behind the scenes. About the same time that David Schein got his draft notice, Ike called Fred Seaton in Nebraska, so I've already mentioned the Seatons to you. Now, Seaton's our newspaper family from Manhattan, just down the road, obviously, from Ike's Abilene. Fred's father had been a secretary to Senator Joseph L. Bristow, who had endorsed Ike's application to West Point. In 1937, 2 decades after Fay Seaton purchased the Manhattan Mercury, which the Seatons still own and run, young Fred moved to Nebraska to become the publisher of the Hastings Daily Tribune. And upon the death of Nebraska's Republican Senator Kenneth Wary in December 1951, the governor appointed Seaton to that seat for a year. And in the Senate, Seaton developed a friendly relationship with Joe McCarthy. He then worked on Eisenhower's 1952 campaign. So we've got David Schein being inducted into the Army. And that same month, in July 1953, Ike asked Fred Seaton to take a redesigned assistant secretary position in the Defense Department. Seaton would serve as the Pentagon's liaison with the press in Congress, and that meant, among other things, he was to manage matters related to Joe McCarthy. Ike told Charles Wilson, the Secretary of Defense, that he'd always looked at Seaton, quote, as a reserve division, ready to go into action. That's a general's formulation. One man would be a reserve division. McCarthy's hearings into alleged communist subversion in the Army continued for months. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that by January 1954, Joe McCarthy was, quote, riding high. Then came the turning point. On January 21st, 1954, Ike's top aides convened in the Attorney General's office. During that meeting, Army Counsel John Adams provided the details of McCarthy and Cohn's repeated attempts to secure special privileges for David Schein. And Chief of Staff Sherman Adams, he'd no relationship to John Adams, Chief of Staff Sherman Adams ordered John Adams to prepare a report. And Adams sent the White House a stack of documents in mid-February. Shortly thereafter, the White House returned those documents to Fred Seaton at the Pentagon with secret presidential orders to edit them into a report for publication. Meanwhile, McCarthy continued his hearings on the Army. He harassed Irving Perez, P-E-R-E-S-S, a dentist drafted into the Army during the Korean War who had invoked his constitutional rights rather than answer if he'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. Naturally, McCarthy branded Perez a communist and subpoenaed Perez's commanding general, General Ralph W. Zwicker, for testimony. Zwicker, that's Z-W-I-C-K-E-R, Ralph Zwicker was one of Ike's boys, a true hero of the war in Europe. And on February 18th, Joe McCarthy confronted Zwicker in a savage performance. Again and again, McCarthy pressed Zwicker for details on how Irving Perez had gotten promoted and honorably discharged. And finally, at the conclusion of that hearing, McCarthy delivered the ultimate insult to this war hero. He charged that Ralph Zwicker was, quote, not fit to wear the uniform of the United States Army. Eisenhower, on vacation in California, was incensed when he heard about the attack on Zwicker. But, as usual, he said nothing to the press. And when Ike returned to Washington on February 24th, he did not know that Army Secretary Robert Stevens that very day had naively agreed to a secret luncheon with McCarthy and the other Republicans on his subcommittee. Now, Bob Stevens, the Army Secretary, intended to plead with McCarthy and the other Republicans to ease up on the military people like Zwicker. Zwicker was supposed to go back and testify, and he wanted to make sure they were going to be treated with respect. But Bob Stevens was simply out of his element dealing with these crafty politicians. And they eventually talked him into signing an agreement that day that the newspapers the next day labeled a surrender. When Stevens arrived back at the Pentagon that afternoon, Fred Seaton bluntly told the secretary that he had been had. And the next morning, the New York Times ran a devastating front-page photograph of McCarthy whispering in Bob Stevens' ear. The newspapers also settled on another false conclusion. As I said, they had fake news in those days. That false conclusion was that because Eisenhower had arrived back at the White House from vacation the same day as Stevens' infamous lunch with Joe McCarthy, the president must have ordered Stevens to surrender. Press Secretary James Hagerty described the president as, quote, very mad and getting fed up. That states it mildly. Dwight Eisenhower was having a full-blown presidential temper tantrum. This was, the president thundered, about my army. This guy McCarthy is going to get into trouble over this, he growled. I'm not going to take this one lying down. My friends tell me it won't be long in this Army stuff before McCarthy starts using my name instead of Stevens. He's ambitious. He wants to be president. He's the last guy in the world who will ever get there if I have anything to say. These are Jim Hagerty's, the press secretary's, wonderful press secretary, marvelous notes on his conversations with the president. Eisenhower ordered Stevens to the White House, accompanied by Fred Seaton. A team led by Richard Nixon drafted a statement for Stevens to issue repudiating that luncheon agreement. Ike himself edited it for 30 minutes, and Hagerty noted, made it stronger. Stevens read the statement to the press. It was filled with the general's terse military language. I shall never accede to the abuse of Army personnel under any circumstances, including committee hearings, Stevens declared. I shall never accede to them being browbeaten or humiliated. When Stevens finished, James Hagerty rose and said, quote, on behalf of the president, he has seen the statement. He approves and endorses it 100%. From that moment on, the fat was in the fire. Fred Seaton and other key Pentagon people intensified their work rewriting John Adams' report on McCarthy, Cone, and Shine. In early March 1954, the Eisenhower forces covertly exploited two other events. On March 9th, both of them on March 9th, 1954, Republican Senator Ralph Flanders of Vermont attacked Joe McCarthy in a speech. This was a Republican senator attacking another Republican senator in a speech on the floor of the United States Senate. Now, did the White House recruit Flanders? I think they did. I can't quite prove it. We know that Flanders had lunched the previous week with his good friend Sherman Adams, the chief of staff, who had been his neighboring governor to Vermont and New Hampshire. Flanders had been the governor of Vermont before he became his senator, and Adams in New Hampshire. Anyway, whether he's recruited or not, in that speech, Flanders asked a loaded question about McCarthy. To what party does he belong? And Flanders answered, "We must conclude that his is a one-man party and that its name is McCarthyism." And Flanders concluded his speech with a sarcastic take on McCarthy's persecution of Irving Perez, the dentist. McCarthy, Flanders boomed, quote, dons his war paint. He goes into his war dance. He emits his war hoops. He goes forth to battle and proudly returns with the scalp of a pink Army dentist. Flanders had already sent a copy of his remarks to Eisenhower, who publicly commended them. That same evening, Edward R. Murrow eloquently condemned McCarthy on his See It Now television program. Any of you remember Edward R. Murrow? Wonderful journalist, just terrific. Excuse me. Murrow included quotations from the Flanders speech in his broadcast. Murrow derided the senator as a one-man committee who had demoralized the present State Department and leveled charges of a conspiracy against the Army, including that General Ralph Zwicker was unfit to serve. Murrow argued that, quote, the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. Murrow closed with devastating eloquence. This is a statement I think that it's beyond its time. It's worth thinking about even in 2017. Murrow said, quote, we will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason. It is no time, Murrow concluded, for people who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent. We cannot, he declared, defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. 2 days later, on March 11th, Fred Seaton released the 34-page report on the privileges McCarthy and Cone had sought for David Shine. He released it on behalf of the Army, not the White House. Eisenhower, even in his memoirs, never acknowledged his role, writing only that the Army, not the White House, moved over to the attack. And Ike, in those memoirs, did not mention Fred Seaton, who was operating under his direct orders. If you want to talk about that in Q&A, why he was that secretive, we can do that. Jim Haggerty confided to his diary about that report, it's a pip, and shows constant pressure by Cone to get Shine a soft Army job with Joe in and out of the threats. Haggerty believed the report, quote, should bust things wide open. It did. The result was a firestorm of controversy leading to the televised Army-McCarthy hearings. Now, there's so much about those hearings. They lasted for 2 months. Anybody remember them? At least when you were children, your parents? No. How many TV networks were there in those days? About 3, right? There was a 4th one, kind of fragmentary. Okay, and at least one of them did gavel-to-gavel covering of these hearings, day in, day out. So, there wasn't there's a lot of things to watch on TV these days, but it wasn't that way in those days. So people watched a lot. And there was much drama in it. I'm going to cite just 2 episodes out of much of the drama that's in the Army-McCarthy hearings. One was, in May, the hearings erupted into demands by both parties, both the Republicans and Democrats, about that January 21st meeting. You remember that, where I said it was a turning point? Okay. About that meeting at which the Eisenhower forces had first fully examined the McCarthy-Cohn-Schein relationship. Joe McCarthy knew about that meeting. He'd been talked to about it afterwards. Ike refused to let his personal advisors be subpoenaed, the people who were in that meeting, and unmask his own involvement. So on May 17th, Eisenhower invoked executive privilege, citing historic precedent for the protection of presidential advisors. There's quite a bit of discussion now in Washington about whether President Trump will invoke executive privilege for some of his subordinates if they get in trouble. So that's been around for a long time, that discussion. Richard Nixon was noted for having invoked executive privilege in part of his scandal. In response, McCarthy challenged government employees to disobey their superiors and report directly to him because, quote, their oath to protect and defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, is a commitment that towers far above any presidential secrecy directive. So McCarthy invited them to report to him instead of the president. Eisenhower shot down McCarthy's tirade with a statement issued under the Attorney General's name. That was typical of this secretive president. Put out a statement. He wrote the statement, but put it out under the Attorney General's name. But then Ike called his press secretary into the Oval Office and vented his rage at, quote, the complete arrogance of McCarthy. Pacing behind his desk, Eisenhower thundered that McCarthy's challenge to federal employees to disobey their superiors, quote, amounts to nothing but a wholesale subversion of public service. McCarthy, he barked, is making exactly the same plea of loyalty to him that Hitler made to the German people. Both tried to set up personal loyalty within the government while both were using the pretense of fighting communism. McCarthy, this is still Ike talking, McCarthy is trying deliberately to subvert the people we have in government, people who are sworn to obey the law, the Constitution, and their superior officers. I think this is the most disloyal act we've ever had by anyone in the government of the United States. If you have any doubt of whether Dwight Eisenhower objected to Joe McCarthy, that ought to tell you. And he compares him to Hitler? I mean, my goodness. The Attorney General's, the Army's attorney, Joe Welch, you've probably heard about, he had a famous confrontation with McCarthy on June 9th, 1954. McCarthy charged that Welch had in his law firm a young man named Fred Fisher who had once been associated with an allegedly pro-communist organization. A hush fell over the room when McCarthy hurled that accusation, and Welch sat with his head in his hands, staring at the table. Joe Welch was a fascinating guy. He became famous out of this. He made a movie eventually. He was a very shrewd operator. Anyway, he's sitting with his head in his hands, and he says to the chairman, Carl Munt, Mr. Chairman, under these circumstances, I must have something approaching a personal privilege. McCarthy was pacing about, ordering aides to retrieve the file on Fred Fisher. Welch repeatedly tried to get McCarthy's attention, but without success. Finally, he declared, until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Fred Fisher was a Harvard Law graduate whom Welch believed was starting what looks to be a brilliant career with us. Little did I dream, Welch continued, you would be so reckless and cruel as to do an injury to that lad. I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. McCarthy resumed his attack on Fisher And Welch interrupted in a commanding voice. "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" That's been the famous phrase that's come down to us out of that. By the time the hearings ended the following week, Joe McCarthy was upside down in the polls. In July 1954, Roy Cohn resigned to return to New York to his law practice, and by the way, there became the lead attorney and the mentor for 13 years to a gentleman named Donald Trump. But that's another story. That's not in my book. On December 2nd, 1954, McCarthy's senatorial colleagues, as we said before, censured him by a vote of 67 to 22. But the ball game was really over by then. That was almost a formality. 2 days later, Eisenhower invited Senator Arthur Watkins of Utah, the chair of the Censure Committee, to the White House. Afterward, the president issued a statement commending Watkins for, quote, "a very splendid job of managing the censure process." That was more than Joe McCarthy could take. On December 7th, he walked into his first hearing, the first hearing of his subcommittee in months, and delivered a public statement apologizing to the American people for supporting Dwight Eisenhower for president. But the political war was over. In a June 1955 meeting with legislative leaders, Eisenhower repeated a joke that was making the rounds then in Washington. "It's no longer McCarthyism," the president said. "It's McCarthyism." Eisenhower finally emerged publicly from his self-imposed silence in an article written for the Reader's Digest just prior to his death. Ike, using a pencil, edited out his harshest criticisms of McCarthy. I wish I could share those with you, but we don't have time. He edited them out. It's typical of him. And still, he could not resist a hint in his final version of the article, quote, "What a lot of people, even today, don't know is that behind the scenes, I was doing all I could to assist those who were wrongly accused, and in many cases, my efforts were effective." Eisenhower recalled that once the struggle with McCarthy was over, a former aide and a critic of his approach to McCarthy came and said to him, "By gosh, Mr. President, you were right about McCarthy." And a smiling Eisenhower responded, "Sometimes I am." Dwight D. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. His article, "We Must Avoid the Perils of Extremism," was published the following month. And for all his editing, Dwight Eisenhower had finally, publicly denounced Joe McCarthy. That's all I have to share with you, but I welcome questions and questions. And if I don't have answers, somebody in the crowd probably will. Okay. Okay. And is this mic on? Are you hearing me? Okay, great. Lawrence does a great job with this technician. So, anybody, no such thing as a dumb question in my classroom, folks. So, anything at all? Yes, sir.
Somewhere recently I heard that Robert Kennedy was part of the McCarthy or Cohn's staff at one point.
That's right, he was.
Was he involved in this attack on the Army and the State Department, as far as you know?
I don't know a lot of detail about that. The Kennedy family and McCarthy were very close, actually, including John Kennedy and Joe Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, Senior Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy was part of the McCarthy staff in '53, but he left fairly soon thereafter, and so he didn't end up playing a big role in the drama I was sketching. I could have missed some things on that regard, and it's you know, always tempting to pick on the Kennedys, but I like Bob Kennedy. I was a Bobby Kennedy delegate to a convention in 1968, but anyway. Okay, but yeah, they were close, and there's still I know a scholar who's working on that and is going to talk write quite a bit about that relationship between the Kennedys and Joe McCarthy. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, oh, yeah. Ma'am, you go first, and then we'll get him. Yeah, thanks for helping me, Trudy.
Do you think that President Eisenhower would have been so active in getting rid of MacArthur if he hadn't attacked the military?
It's hard to answer. I think he loathed him anyway. I think Ike thought he was very destructive in all kinds of ways. Certainly, that played a big role. To go after the Army with his five-star general in the White House was a big thing. I like to think that he would have eventually, but that may have made it, may have exacerbated it. He recruited Fred Seaton for that job before those Army-McCarthy hearings started. So that might be a clue. I can't give you a definitive answer about that, but I kind of think he loathed him, and he loathed him well before that happened. Yes, sir.
Did the Army-McCarthy hearings get involved with the celebrities and movie figures from Hollywood, or was that in a separate proceeding?
No, most of that was done even years earlier by the Un-American Activities Committee, House Un-American, HUAC, H-U-A-C, House Un-American Activities Committee, in the late 40s and early 50s, went after, so the blacklisting of writers and actors and all that happened. Joe McCarthy didn't do much of that. Some of it spilled over, but he was mainly after communists in government, and that's what he went after more than anything from the time he became famous in 1950 onward. So, he's not innocent in it, but he didn't do all that. It started, we need to say that McCarthyism started before McCarthy became famous. And there's some experts in the subject will say it continued afterwards. You got to remember this is a paranoia on the part of the American people, and demagogues take advantage of it. But the demagogue didn't invent the paranoia. And, and I think we're in a very paranoid period right now. I think we all need to think about that. Okay. Yes. And please wave at me if I miss. My peripheral vision is not what it used to be.
Would you please tell us Joe McCarthy's education and his career prior to his Senate?
Oh, goodness. This is going to test my bad memory. He was Wisconsin. He became a judge. He got his high school diploma very, very late. And suddenly I'd have to reach for where he did his degree work. My apology, I don't have that in my head right now. I should know, and I don't. I apologize. Yes. By the way, McCarthy's senatorial papers are still not available for research. And probably your question highlights that there is some distortion in my account because of that. His records are still locked up and nobody can get into them as long as his adopted daughter is living. And they're at Marquette University in Wisconsin. But I apologize I can't answer that question. Yes, sir.
We know that Cohn became an advisor and mentor to Trump, but what happened to Schein?
David Schein married a Miss Universe candidate 2 years later and had 6 children. And one reason people have not quite believed that this was the LG, you're acquainted with the LGBT thing, okay? Some people are bisexual. And so he had 6 children, although we must say that gay men in those days did get married and have children. And it's happened fairly, in my lifetime, that's happened. So he had 6 children. He worked basically in the family's big hotel business. He died in a plane crash, I forget exactly when now, in the early 60s, I think. Yes.
How did McCarthy from Wisconsin come to hire Roy Cohn as his attorney?
I don't know that answer to that question. That's an excellent question, and I wish I could answer it for you. I don't know. Well, Cohn had already established a reputation for, oh dear. Grace, help me, the people who were to be executed. Yeah, the Rosenbergs. All of a sudden, I'm sorry, I was in the hospital for about 3 weeks this summer. Still parts of my brain I think they didn't let me bring home. Yeah, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and Cohn is a young prodigy. He was good. I mean, when he got his law degree, he was too young to take the law exam in New York initially. And he worked on that, and he worked on other big cases, so he was already known as a legal prodigy in that case. The personal interaction with him, I do not know. But he was a no, I won't use that kind of language. He was a mean man. Okay.
Do you know if any government officials or staff ever lost their jobs as a result of the McCarthy hearings?
Oh, I don't know that. If you ask about the hearings, I can't name anybody to you right now. You know, McCarthy was devastated, and obviously Cohn left. I don't know of any. Although lots of people lost their jobs during this period, particularly if there were rumors that they were homosexual. And that was the underlying thing of this, although nobody talked about it. It's a really curious thing. Joe Welch at one point in one of the hearings talks about he's grilling one of McCarthy's aides where they got a doctored photograph that had been doctored and brought in kind of false evidence. And Joe, why am I reaching for it? Pardon? Joe, the order. I'm getting tired, I'm sorry. Welch, yeah, okay. Joe Welch, I didn't sleep well the last couple of nights. Joe Welch was grilling this aide about that, and the aide didn't know where the doctored photograph had come from, and Welch said, "Well, you think it came from a pansy? Is that right? Pixie. Yeah, you think you came from a pixie." And in 1950s, that was a euphemism for homosexuality. And Joe McCarthy spoke up and he said, "Well, what's a pixie?" And see, she reads everything I write, so she knows something better than me. McCarthy spoke up and said, "What's a pixie?" And Welch said, "Well, it's something akin to a fairy." And any of you old enough to remember that was a slur that people would use and boys in junior high would use against one another during that time. So the homosexuality thing was under wraps, and yet it was there. Everybody knew it was there. And of course, the interesting thing, you asked about Roy Cohn background, Cohn persecuted homosexuals without any conscience whatever. Never, by the way, never came out of the closet, died of AIDS in 1986. So, well, you come up with 3 or 4 things I couldn't answer. If I forget who Joe Welch is, I'm sorry. Anybody else have a question? I probably got to ask who my timekeeper. Are you my timekeeper, Eric?
Well, she has a question right here.
Okay, all right. Wave at me if you think that we've run out of gas.
I was wondering about McCarthy's family and also about how he died.
About how he died? Yeah, the obituary said that he died of oh dear, Grace, this is going to, it wasn't cirrhosis. They didn't announce it cirrhosis. It was, what's the word about infection of the liver? Yeah, acute hepatitis, I think. They didn't say sclerosis, though that's what we suspect. And you've asked him about his family. He married, her name escapes me now, married one of his aides, quite a few years younger than he was. There were lots of rumors that Joe was gay. I don't think that's been validated, however. I'm not satisfied that was the case. And, you know, I get a little tired of all that gay bashing kind of stuff that goes on even for us historians. We have to dig into it. But I haven't answered that very well. I apologize. Anything else that I don't know? Rilla?
David, I think it is really interesting that you are about the first person to write about this subject. And would you tell the group...
I am the first.
That's what I thought. And would you tell the group why you think you were able to get a hold of this material?
Well, thank you for that. You asked me something I know. Okay. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, my profession has not been kind to Dwight Eisenhower. And the profession has been particularly locked in to dominance by East Coast liberal democratic Ivy League historians who never quite forgave Ike for defeating Adlai Stevenson in 1952. And you know, I heard Adlai speak. I'm old enough. Gee, he was good, you know. But that happened. But Fred Seaton is the key. And during the hearings, Eisenhower ordered Seaton to collect every McCarthy-related document in sight in the Pentagon. And he collected them, something like 10,000 pages worth. And Seaton took those documents, kept those documents, and took them with him when he went to the White House to become an advisor there and then became Secretary of the Interior. He took them with him to the Interior Department. I mentioned Bill Ewald, author of A Generation Ago. Bill Ewald worked for Fred Seaton there, and he said he remembered Seaton pointing to this locked file and saying, "I will never open that until you know who tells me to open it." And Seaton took those documents home with him to Nebraska. And then finally, when Fred Seaton died, they were given to the Eisenhower Library. And so in answer to your question, I found most of this, almost 95% of it, in that 10,000 pages. It's all kinds of memoranda, telephone call transcripts. In those days, they didn't record the calls, hardly ever, but you had somebody, a good what do you call them? Stenographer. Yeah, taking notes and had written, verbatim. So all kinds of stuff like that. And as I said, Jim Haggerty kept minimal, microscopic notes, almost impossible to read in his handwriting, about his meetings with Eisenhower. But that's why, so the documents are there. And Bill Ewald had looked at them. Bill had been an aide in the Eisenhower White House, and he never could quite bring himself to believe that Ike engineered it. And the only thing, I got to know Bill, a wonderful guy. He died about 2 years ago. He always believed that somehow these subordinates just put it all together. And it just fell together, sort of. And I think he believed that because I used to ask him if he believed everything that Chief of Staff Sherman Adams told him. And he said yes. And I said, he should not have. I don't think, Eisenhower's subordinates were not free agents. They were to do what they were to do. And even in doing speaking engagements, they had to clear the speeches with him. They were not free agents to do just what they wanted. And I'm quite satisfied that it's provable that he was behind it. Oh, goodness. Well, maybe that's about enough. Is there any burning question? Okay. Thank you. You've been most kind. Let's see, we do have books and book signing out there if anybody's interested. So.